public with us as well. Great. So I'd like to call the meeting to order. This is the Board of Elementary and Secondary Education Accountability Work Group. Can I get a motion, please?
Motion.
Got a motion and a second.
Second.
Second. All right. I think we need a roll call. Can someone help us with the roll call?
This is Dr. Bofi, and I'm present.
All right.
Sandy Holloway. Hi, everyone.
All right. Thank you, guys. And Ronnie Morris, president, accounted for. All right. With that, I'd like to move on to the next item, which is our welcome and introductions. So just a word here. First of all, I want to thank everyone for their time today. Just really proud of the accomplishments that we've made and that our students have made in the state of Louisiana. We were #1 in the country in growth for 4th grade reading. So it feels good to be #1. We want to keep that conversation going. And part of that is we want to really have confidence in the system where we're recognizing those significant accomplishments. And so we're gathering this group together here today to establish the current approach that we're using to assess individual student growth. Mr. Thomas Lambert is here to help us with that. And then we've got a group of subject matter experts from across the country who we'll introduce here in just a minute. But they're here to help us to develop a list of options so that when the next Bessie comes on board here shortly, then they'll have a document in layman's terms that describes the current system that's used for individual growth assessment in the state of Louisiana. And they'll also have a list of options in case they want to look beyond that. So we've gathered this list, this group of subject matter experts from across the country to help us to develop that list. That list will be a list of proven options from across the country. Our goal is to provide pros and cons of each one. In addition to that, we like to get some sense of what that runway looks like. If the new board chose to go with one of those options, how long would it take to get that in place? And then also we want to get some sort of estimate for the cost associated with that and the human resource requirement. So that's basically the goal of this activity. We're very, very excited that we've got Mr. Chris Domoleski to lead and facilitate this exercise. So Chris, I'm going to kick the ball over to you. Thank you again, and ask you if you would introduce yourself and introduce the rest of your team.
Thank you, Mr. Morris. Very pleased to be invited to be part of this important project. As Ronnie said, my name is Chris Domoleski. I'm the Associate Director for the National Center for the Improvement of Educational Assessment. We're based in Dover, New Hampshire, and we work with, I think over 35 states now, and helping support development and validation of strong assessment and accountability models. I'm pleased to be joined by my colleague, Chris Brandt. Chris is going to help me facilitate and document, and I'm very pleased to have his support. And then members of the panel, I see Greg, Christy, and Mike, and I'm hoping they'll each introduce themselves so that they can properly let you know who they are and maybe a bit about their background. We have another panelist that I'm scanning a list for, and as soon as she arrives, I'll make sure that she gets promoted so that we can see her and hear from her as well. But maybe we'll start with Greg, then we'll go to Christy, and then to Mike. So Greg, would you lead us off with an introduction, please, sir?
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Greg Cizik. I guess, Chris, you asked for a brief bio. I started a career 5 years as an elementary school teacher, and then worked for a testing company, and most recently I'm wrapping up about 23 years of service at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill as Guy B. Phillips Professor of Educational Measurement and Evaluation.
Christy Hovanitz. I am a senior policy fellow at the Foundation for Excellence in Education, a nonprofit run by former Governor Jeb Bush out of Florida. I've been there for about 15 years. Prior to that, I was the Assistant Commissioner of Education in Minnesota. And before that, I was a Deputy Commissioner in Florida. Both roles helped stand up the assessment and accountability systems there.
Hi, I'm Mike Russell. I'm a professor at Boston College in the Measurement, Evaluation, Statistics, and Assessment program. Um, I don't know, I specialize in computer-based testing, and for many years I've been serving on various state tax, and so have become very familiar with a number of different issues that state assessment programs encounter. So, and I'm pleased to be here.
Thank you. Thank you, all the members of the panel. And again, we hope we can introduce you to Christine as well when she arrives. So I will pass the baton back to you, Mr. Morris, and those in the room for any other introductory remarks, and I'll be prepared to give an overview whenever you're ready.
Chris, thank you so much, and thank you to our subject matter experts for keeping panel this up. Thank you for committing your time to this very important exercise. Members, I'd like to see if we could get a motion for the next item on our agenda. Consideration of the purpose and particularly the timeline regarding this activity.
So moved.
Dr. Bofi, Ms. Holloway, thank you. Want to pass the ball now to Mr. Thomas Lambert from the Louisiana Department of Education. He's going to speak to us about the timeline for our project.
Thank you so much, Mr. Morris. And also wanted to point out that Dr. Brumley could not be with us physically here today, but he is indeed watching through the power of Zoom visiting schools, but he took some time out of that to watch this. So he is indeed watching with us. Mr. Morris introduced a motion a couple months ago to Bessie to convene this group again and continue this work. We will have a final report in December. And Chris Domaleski at the center is going to help facilitate this process and the creation of that collateral. And I'll turn it to Chris at this point to share more.
Great. So I'll give just a quick overview of the process, and I can pause for questions afterwards. So just a moment, I'm going to share my screen. I did get a note that Christine is working on joining us. So as soon as she does, we will make sure to introduce her and include her. So just a moment while I do a share screen. Okay, are folks seeing my screen share? Are you seeing the proper view?
Yes, sir.
Okay, great. So I think this will be familiar to many of you, but just to make sure we all start with a shared understanding of how we came to assemble this group and what we're about. You may know that the Louisiana State Board of Elementary and Secondary Education has directed the Department of Education to implement a process to study and make recommendation to strengthen Louisiana's measurement of student academic growth that's used for the state school and district accountability system. The state has a strong tradition as a leader in academic growth, and I think as part of an ongoing process of monitoring and improvement and investigation, wants to make sure to devote some time and resources to making sure that model is as strong and appropriate, defensible as possible. And so they have asked us to bring together a group of advisors, and you've heard from those advisors just a moment ago. And the center, as we mentioned, we'll coordinate and facilitate the meetings. And as Thomas mentioned, we'll also play a role in helping to create the report that comes from this process as a deliverable to the State Board of Elementary and Secondary Education. We see this as a document that explains our review process, how often we met, the things that we talked about, when we convened, the kinds of feedback that we received, and importantly, we'll describe the growth models that the panel believes are established, appropriate, technically defensible, really point to those practices and approaches that are deemed most promising. As I mentioned, this capstone report is obviously an important part of this project together, what we're all working towards. We expect that information in the report will be informed by a scan of literature. We know that we're not starting from zero. There's been a substantial amount of research and writing that has preceded our process here, and we want to draw on strong works from the literature and have that inform our recommendations and the things that we put in the capstone report. We want to look at practices across the country and learn from strong practices and learn from any limitations that have been identified through a decade or more of growth model implementation across the country. And certainly the reason we have a panel is because we value their expertise and advice, and that's going to be obviously a very influential part of pulling this together and putting together feedback for LDOE and for BESI. We expect to address strengths and limitations of various growth approaches, and as Mr. Morris indicated, provide some implementation guidance, because we know it's obviously more than just technical attributes often that influence practice, things like transparency, things like ability to implement, make it very feasible to implement at scale. Those matter as well. So we want to address those practical aspects of growth modeling that relate to the use case for LDU as well. And then once again, the center will draft that report and we'll ensure that it reflects the perspectives of the panel. The way I see things moving forward is that we'll see that report start to come together through our engagements this fall, and that we'll make sure the panel and all the contributors have an opportunity to see how it's progressing and shape its final form. I believe that, I just have a note about the timeline. We've been working up to this point, as many of you know, to impanel this very strong advisory group that we have. Really pleased that we have such an amazing group. Here we are at the end of August. We just made it, August 31st. We're having our kickoff meeting, and we'll say more about what we hope to accomplish at this meeting here in a moment. But we hope it's an opportunity for us to understand what our charge is and to get a good understanding of current practices. Between September and November, we expect to have 3 more meetings. And during that time, we'll be evaluating research, we'll be reviewing some practices, and again, we'll be inviting our panel to comment on that and to help us draw the best from those sources of information I mentioned a moment ago in order to put together a strong final deliverable for this project. And I'm sure there'll be a fair amount of work between meetings, but we'll use our meetings to make sure that we're very clear about our progress and our accomplishments to date. We expect to have a draft report in November, and again, we want to have that in time for folks to review and make sure that it gets refined in ways that reflect, make sure it's true to our charge and reflect the perspectives of the task of the advisory group, and then we'll have that final report by the end of this calendar year. So that is a note about the timeline, and I'm going to stop sharing, and we can open it up for any questions or comments from the panel now, if you like, and then we'll turn it back over.
Chris, I just had one question that I put in the chat, which is, will there be an opportunity for the TAP to meet to discuss the draft report, or will that all be done individually?
I'm hoping that we'll be able to use our time together through our virtual convenings to do just that, Greg. So that's a great question. But I'm hoping that a focus of some of our future meetings will be that we'll be reviewing parts of it as it comes together, and then the entire report in full. In the best case, I think we'll be able to give you a draft before our last meeting. We can spend a substantial part of that meeting making sure we got it right.
Very good. Thank you.
That's a good question. I got a note that Christine is in the waiting room. I don't see her. Christine, if you're one of the attendees, if you raise your hand, I'll make sure we promote you to the panel. And while I work on that, I will turn it back over to our colleagues there at Baton Rouge.
All right, thanks, Chris. Thanks, Chris, and please be sure and let us know whenever she's available so we can recognize her and welcome her as well. Want to move on to the next item on our agenda. So I'd like to get a motion for consideration of an overview and uses of the current growth model. It's Holloway, got a second.
Second.
Mr. Bophy. All right, so we're going to pass the ball to Mr. Lambert. Mr. Lambert, if you would.
Happy to take this from here. Can the panel see the slides?
I can. Thank you very much. And Christine, it looks like have you been promoted? I think I've got you. Okay, go ahead, Thomas. I'm sorry. Maybe we're still working on that, but we can hear you loud and clear. Thank you.
Perfect. So wanted to give a quick overview of how growth is currently used in the state of Louisiana. Wanted to start with a slide that shows the ways in which we use the VAM model that Louisiana has used for many years. We use it in teacher evaluations, and it's part of the overall teacher evaluation score. We use it in school accountability as part of the progress index, step 2, which I'll explain during this presentation. TAP schools use it for performance-based incentives. Teacher prep programs have an accountability system, and VAM is included in that. The Board of Regents also has a teacher preparation program and effectiveness measurement, which uses our VAM model, as well as after-school accountability. So it is used for the overall evaluation of the extent to which programs are good according to the measure that we're using. So what is a value-added model? Put a real quick summary here. It measures the extent to which the student success was compared to similar peers year to year. It predicts how well students will perform on the assessment in comparison to their peers with a similar prior assessment score and background. Once a student's taken several assessments, the model can then look at the extent to which their achievement was on target with what was expected. And then the difference between the student's actual achievement and his or her expected achievement is known as the value added. So wanted to provide a real quick example of how this works. A student's VAM score is representative of the difference between the student's actual achievement and his or her expected achievement. The student score can be positive. The student's VAM score can be positive or negative. If a student did exactly as the VAM model expected them, then their VAM score would be 0. So in this example, the student's expected score was 710. Their actual score was 775. So their overall VAM score was plus 65. Wanted to include for the panel the data that are used in the VAM calculation. So already talked about looking at prior year scores. We look at student attendance, student expulsion and suspension, student mobility, their classification, whether they're special education or gifted, 504 classification, economically disadvantaged, including the different types of reasons why a student was flagged as economically disadvantaged, whether they were on identified as being on SNAP or TANF or Medicaid. Each of those is treated differently. And then lastly, English language learners. Any questions thus far from the panel?
It indicates that those are data used in the model. Does that mean that those are data used to identify peers?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Lambert, not a question, but since there's a pause in the presentation, I want to acknowledge Christine, who's been able to join us, and just give her an opportunity to introduce herself if she'd like.
That's very kind of you, and I apologize for disrupting the flow. My name is Chris Don Francesco, and I'm honored to be here and to work with you all. Very much looking forward to the work. I'm a senior policy analyst at the National Education Association, and look forward to the good work. Thank you.
Chris, welcome to the group. Thrilled to have you here. Earlier, we recognized significant accomplishments by our students in the state of Louisiana. We were #1 in growth in the country in 4th grade reading, and none of that would be possible without the perseverance of our teachers. So want to shout out to our teachers. And then, of course, part of this activity is purpose so that we can accurately capture the growth that our teachers have made possible with their hard work. So that's truly part of this exercise as well. Give credit where credit's due. And certainly we've had some teachers go through some really, really challenging times, and we want to celebrate those victories. So thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you.
So additional parts of the VAM calculation, it looks at promotion and retention patterns for students, class composition. So if a class had a larger than average number of students with disabilities, for example, that is a factor that our VAM model looks at. It also has capitation methods to avoid ceiling effects. And then there's also Bayesian shrinkage that's involved for extreme variability across some students in some teachers' classrooms, and to account for the fact that some teachers' results are based on a relatively small number of students, and the volatility that that can have in it. So wanted to provide a quick walkthrough of how that VAM score is calculated. We're going to talk about Susie. So Susie scored an approaching basic in ELA each of the past 3 years with no retention. Comparing Susie to students with the similar prior year pattern, her peers, she is expected to score an approaching basic of 719 this year. Susie has a speech language disability, and based on regression analysis, the unique contribution of speech language disabilities is a decrease of 1.5 points, meaning that all students with speech language disabilities scored on average 1.5 points below their peers. Thus, her expected score is reduced to a 717.5. Susie also missed 15 days of school. A similar regression analysis occurs, and that results in a decrease of 0.1, meaning that on average, students missing 15 or more school days scored 1.5 points below their peers, so 15 times 0.1. Thus, her expected score is further adjusted, and we get down to 716. There are no other characteristics that we talked about earlier, mobility, discipline, retention, that apply to Susie, so those don't impact her expected score. As a result, with her actual score being a 726, she exceeded that 716 by 10, and her VAM score is 10.
Mr. Lambert, where did the initial goal of 719 come from?
It came from what the value-added model, what the model said her expected score would be based off of what other students that had scored similar to her in the past scored. So it looks at what the students that had the same pattern as her in the past got, and that is what she would be expected to get.
Were these students, how do we know if these students had the same, I understand some of the parameters that are considered, but do we know that these other students that she's being compared to, do they have the same capacity, for example? I'm just really trying to get a better appreciation for how that goal is established. I know we're comparing her to her peers.
We're comparing her to students who scored similarly to her in the past. So it's looking at students who started at a certain point, where did they get to? And then she's compared to those students. And the panel may be able to explain this a lot better than I can.
It looks like we have a hand up.
Mr. Russell.
Yeah, a quick question. When this model is built, is it based on prior year students, and then effectively the model is being applied to this year's students to predict how they're gonna perform this year, or is it based on how they actually perform this year to build the model, and then you're basically looking at residuals?
It's going to be this year. We use the actual year's data, so it's less of a predicted score and more of an expected score based off the current year.
So is the average residual across all students 0?
It should be 0. It's probably not exactly 0, but I can get you that data, but it should be 0.
Well, the reason I'm asking this, maybe I'm like 2 meetings ahead, but I'm trying to, like, as we're thinking about this, one of the challenges with growth when you're kind of comparing students to students, and this is relatively a norm-based approach, just like some of the other approaches. In a percentile based, the mean ends up being 50. In this case, the mean ends up being 0. So how does the state then, or any state using these approaches, then compare how much growth they had on average as a state with other states if the mean is 0? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, we can give you a full technical report, and we'll also show you how we use this information in accountability in just a second.
Okay.
If I could jump in, Mike, is one of your questions about whether or not it's baselined and run and the effects are compared to a baseline versus renormed every year? Is that sort of implied in your questions?
Well, yeah, I guess that. Yeah, I mean, because if you're using, if you're building the model based on previous year's data, that's similar to a baseline effectively.
Right.
But when you do that, it's then possible for everyone's growth in that next year to be above zero.
Right.
But if you're building it based on this year's kids alone, then the mean should be zero technically.
Yeah, that's
So
I think it's an important point to bring. I mean, that's something that we'll take as a note from this as we work to collect some more detailed technical documentation that we look specifically for those attributes. I appreciate that, Mike.
So once the VAM score is determined, it is then included in the school performance score. So in the elementary schools, it's 25% of the school's overall school performance score. All students that have a valid earned score from the prior year are included for ELA and math for the school's current school year. And there's a two-step process that we follow in order to turn that VAM score into a progress index score. So in step one, the question is, are students achieving the trajectory that they need in order to get to mastery by 8th grade? If it's a high school, it's by 10th grade, but for simplicity, by 8th grade. If they do that, they get the maximum number of points in the formula, 150. If they do not do that, then it goes into step two, and it looks at the VAM model to determine the student's growth rate comparable to their peers, and the points are awarded based off of the percentile in which their VAM residual lined up next to each other they fall into. So if they're in the 80th to 99th percentile, they get max credit. If they're in the 60th to 79th, they get 115, all the way down to 25 points at 20th to 39th percentile, and then no points at the 1st to 19th percentile. So step one is absolute growth toward their mastery target. If they make the same progress year over year, then they will get to mastery by 8th grade. Or if they don't earn the 150 points there, it is then based off of their VAM result. Any questions here?
Sorry, this is Mike again. For step two, I'm assuming this is the average growth for students in a school.
No, it's each individual student. So if there's 100 students, each of them gets somewhere between 0 and 150 points based off of that individual percentile. It is not the school's overall percentile. It is each student in that school's percentile.
Okay, and then you take an average of those points for the school?
That's right.
Okay.
I do have a comment. And I just want to say that even hearing this before, and I've had the luxury of being around for a long time with all this work, is that even for someone who's been here for a while, this is really complex. And so a North Star that I think we can hold up is a way to do this work in a way that we can communicate it to parents and educators. I think there would be a lot of value there. I know this can be very technical, and that is certainly a challenge, but I do think people understanding it will give them more trust in the system.
Great point. Thank you for that, Dr. Brophy.
So then the question comes up, what about students who are already in the advanced category or who have already met mastery? So for highest achieving students scoring in that advanced category, if they were advanced the prior year and they stay in the advanced category, they earn the maximum number of points. If they drop a level and they're still in mastery, they of course go into step two. And there is also a floor that is not listed here that they can't go below 80 points because the student scored mastery even though they declined. For students scoring mastery in the prior year, they do have a continued improvement target, which is based off of advanced instead of mastery. So it's how many points would they need to grow every year to get to advanced. So that's their step one. And then step two, they go into the VAM model as well. I see Mike thinking, and I know there's going to be a question, which I'm excited about because they have been great questions so far.
Well, I get my one question is are these like, do you use a vertical scale across the grade level tests?
We do not.
Okay. I'm trying to figure out in my mind, well, obviously in my mind, but how you're estimating the growth to get to advanced. Presumably the meaning of different scale points from year to year is going to be slightly different.
But we essentially, we have a scale that is not vertical. It is made to look sort of, it's 750 is mastery across all the grade levels. So the difference in the number of points, you can subtract them from each other and divide and know the number of points per year. Like how meaningful that is or technically defensible that is something that I hope the panel will talk about as y'all get more information about our tests and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, let me try this out, Mr. Lambert, and tell me if this is conceptually right. Again, we'll look to examine this in more detail. But so we have a student who's at mastery, and so we're going to ask the question, at what percentile of growth would that student need to grow in order to reach advanced the next year? If their percentile is at or above that, they're said to meet that growth rate target. Is that conceptually how the model is?
Let's not percentile, but you're close. So a student scored 750 last year. They need to get to, let's do a different example. A student needs to grow 10 points to get to advanced. That's what they need in order to do that. They have 2 years. They have to grow 5 points each year to get the maximum number of points. So it's not percentile. It is from 750 to the next cut point, which is 800.
Okay, well, that's important. Thank you, because that does imply a vertical scale.
A vertical. Okay. It's definitely made to look like that is what is happening, but that is not what's happening.
Chris, I think it implies that a 5-point increment in 1 year is the same as a 5-point increment in another year, which I think and I'm not sure the name of the person who's speaking, but when he first described it, he said it's not really a vertical scale, but it's like a quasi-vertical like scale. And I think that, at least if my understanding is right, that would explain it, that you're just sort of making an assumption that a 5-point increase is a 5-point increase.
That is indeed the assumption in the policy.
Got it. Which, yeah, I mean, probably technically speaking isn't 100% accurate, but it's a rough and ready estimate that probably suffices in the current system.
And then this slide just shows those 2 steps again. Step 1 is the student on track to mastery in terms of number of points they need to get there over the course of time. Step 2, based off of their VAM score. And then there is the mastery floor. Questions?
Mr. Lambert, I have 2. First one, I wanted to get a better understanding for the material that's presented on the test. One story I guess I've heard is that the test material that the student covers that for that grade level is material that was presented for that year. And so we're looking at how much progress the student made on the material on the test, which again represents what was covered that school year. But so many students in Louisiana, unfortunately, are not starting at the school year. They're starting 1, 2, 3, and sometimes even further behind the school year. And we want to capture the actual incremental growth. So I'd like to get a better understanding of, what the test material actually covers, and are we missing anything here? When our teachers can grow a student maybe 1 or 2 years in a school year, but they're have a different starting point. So I want to make sure that we cover that, and we're not missing any actual growth. So if you could maybe speak to that, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, I can give the facts as I understand them and let the panel kind of take it from here. The assessment that we give in Louisiana does measure the grade level standards of the student, that the grade that the student is in. So that is correct. If they're in 3rd grade and they don't score very well, they don't get to mastery. When they get to 4th grade, they're being measured against 4th grade standards, which are different from 3rd grade standards. And those 3rd grade standards don't appear on that 4th grade test. So that is indeed the truth.
Oh, well, I'll just add to that's a federal requirement, right? For the on-grade assessments have to be based on on-grade content standards.
But the question that I think that Mr. Morris, I think that he rightfully asks is, the federal requirement is X, but are there ways for us to gather this information still and make informed decisions about student improvement and progress? Which doesn't have to be answered today, but I think that it's something that he's trying to get put on the list for us to have some thoughts around from the panel.
Thank you, Mr. Lambert. I would actually consider that a critical point. Thank you. Yep.
Can I go back to ask my colleagues whether the VAM conditioning sort of accounts for that, right? Doesn't it take students who let's say are 2 years behind, as represented by their scale scores over the previous years? Wouldn't it compare their progress to other students who were similarly 2 years behind? So in a way, I think it's being accounted for.
Yeah, that's my understanding as well, Greg. I see that. I want to cut you off if you want to explore that further. I also see Christy has her hand up. If it's okay, we'll go ahead and recognize her. Yeah.
Hi, Thomas. Couple questions. In step 1, when you are calculating points needed to demonstrate on track to proficiency or mastery, is it recalculated every year, or is it held constant for the student? So if they miss it in a current year, is the expectation greater the next year? And if they make it in the current year, is the expectation less than the next year?
It's recalculated each year.
Okay. And then in step 2, do you ever encounter negative growth targets for expectations?
You mean where the scale score that's expected is lower than
what they currently have?
Yes.
Okay. And then what is the in the accountability calculation, what % of kids meet step 1 versus what % of kids meet step 2?
I have not looked at it since last year, and my numbers might be fuzzy. We'll get you exact numbers. I want to say 27% is sticking out in my head. It is somewhere in the around a quarter are getting step 1. So the vast majority of the points are being awarded through the relative measure, not the absolute.
Thank you.
I'd like to go back to my question again and probe a little bit more. If a student is, let's say, 1 year behind, and we're looking at their peers who potentially are 1 year behind as well, we're assuming that they scored relatively close on the test that year. Then there are other students in the class that are 2 years behind. And we're saying that they all scored, I'm sorry, Mr. What's below approaching basic?
Unsatisfactory.
Okay, and let's say they're all scoring unsatisfactory. to what degree of resolution is there once I'm at that point, to where a student is 1 year behind or 2 years behind or 3 years behind, and they're all scoring unsatisfactory? Or is there enough resolution there to really understand, how far behind these students are? Or do we just put them all in a group and say, they're all behind, they're all in that unsat category?
Yeah, I can offer a perspective on this if you like.
And the reason, I bring that up is it's astounding to me, but, we have to deal with reality. And when I visit schools in my Bessie district, one high school, for example, there are 400 or 500 students in the high school, and the principal tells me that the average literacy level for incoming freshmen is 4th grade. So that's the reality that we're dealing with, and that's why I'm probing this so hard.
Well, it's a good point to make, Mr. Morris, for a number of reasons, not least of which is it invites us to consider that there are elements we need to ask of the assessments and of the model, and the two have to work together in order to accomplish the policy objectives. So as a practical matter, every assessment of reasonable length, and every state's going to want to have an assessment of reasonable length, has a floor and a ceiling. And it's a grade level assessment, and it only covers so much real estate between the floor and the ceiling. And the floor, technically, we call that the lowest obtainable scale score. Below that, there's too much error to get good estimates, and the same for the ceiling. And so when we talk about you use the term resolution, maybe if you're open to this, maybe that's also a synonym. That would be something like sensitivity. How much sensitivity is there to detect and honor progress? And that would be obfuscated by scores that are indistinguishable from the lowest obtainable scale score, because we just lack the measurement precision. So a way to sort of headline all this is to say, we can do a lot of work with the growth model, but if the issue is related to the test itself, we can only get so far. And we have to look at both to understand how complete any proposed solution is. I don't know if there's any follow-ups or any additions to that. I also see that there's a number of hands that are up, but I appreciate the point, because I think it gives us an opportunity to give voice to something very important.
Yeah, Chris, you're facilitating this, so I'm going to let you call on these folks with the hands raised. Thank you.
Sure, you bet. I apologize that I don't necessarily know the order they came up, so I'm going to go Mike, Christy, and Greg. Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, I was just going to build on what you were saying, Chris. I think it's complicated to think about years behind and this growth, because as I understand it, the Louisiana assessment doesn't indicate where you are in terms of your years. You are, if you were taking the 4th grade test, you're in 4th grade. I think you're referring to some like reading assessments outside of the Louisiana assessment system that might suggest that a student is reading at a 3rd grade level or at a 2nd grade level. And if that's true, and we're talking about the Louisiana reading language arts assessment, it's assumed that if you have students who are reading 2 years below grade level and others that are reading 1 year below grade level, the kids on average who are 2 years are going to have lower score on the language art assessment than the kids who are 1 year. And so if that, assuming that, to Chris's point, that at that lower end of the scale range, that it's sensitive enough to separate those kids who are performing below grade level in reading. And if that's the case, then you still are comparing students who are 2 years below grade level with kids who are 2 years below grade level. So I'm not, based on my understanding, I don't think that's necessarily an issue, assuming it's that you can separate those kids through, because the scores are sensitive enough.
Would it be helpful to bring data on the sensitivity? Because the CSIM is fairly high down there, like 20 points. So the error is pretty large in terms of being able to determine whether or not that student is 2 or 3 grade levels behind, because it's only a 50 wide achievement level with the standard error of 20.
I think it would start, Thomas, with just a cumulative frequency distribution, just to see the spread. I mean, how many students do we have that are clustered in that region? You know, if everybody's above the loss, then it's not an issue. I doubt that's the case. That would be the first state I've ever seen with that pattern. But if a third of the students in the state are there, then we'd say, oh goodness, a sensitivity issue may be indeed at work. So
I think that's what this exercise is all about, right? Is we want to make sure we've got the right fit, right? That we've got the assessment that's the right fit for this student population. And so by looking at that frequency, I think that'll give us the picture that we're looking for, and you guys get a sense of what our base case is.
Christy, you've been patient.
Thank you. Hey, Thomas. When I'm looking at step 1 and 2, what % of the students who use step 2, for which schools are being awarded points, eventually meet mastery? And specifically by the percentile rank of your 80 to 99, 60 to 79, 40 to 59, 20 to 39, and 0 to 19.
So you would want us to look at so look at 1 year of kids a couple years ago, and look at the kids that were in, I don't know, 5th grade, 4th grade, and then by 8th grade, what % of the kids by each of those percentile bands actually got to mastery by 8th grade. That's what you're looking for?
I think so. What I'm wondering is, given that we can have negative scale score expected values to demonstrate mastery, and schools are earning points for outcomes that aren't very meaningful to students, what % of those students are actually meeting mastery if they're using step 2? Because it sounds like a majority of students are using step 2. Some of the step 2 expectations are essentially negative growth expectations based on the scale. So schools are still earning points for them under those conditions. How many of those students, given the schools that are earning points for them, are actually getting students to mastery, or what the ultimate goal is, demonstrating progress on your state assessment?
Yeah, that's something that we can get before the next meeting.
So I think the reason I'm asking that is, what are we incentivizing? So it sounds like we might not be incentivizing high enough expectations for growth to get students where we need them to be in Louisiana.
Thank you for that, Christy. Ms. Holloway's got a question at the board here, if we could. Ms. Holloway?
Thank you, Christy, for those questions. And I want to piggyback on what she's asking. Help me understand the comments about students who receive negative growth receive additional points. Is that right? In our system?
Yeah. So in step 2, it looks at how much they exceeded their expected score compared to their peers. So if a group of students are very far behind, and it's expected that as the test expectation goes up, their score goes down on average, then you could have a case where a student who was very far behind may no longer be on 3rd grade level, even though it's a 5th grade test. They might be at a 3.5, like grade 3.5 on the 6th grade test, and their scale score still went down. And
they received points.
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
that's in question. Okay,
and that's
please.
and that's the point that Christy's making,
Mhm.
that seeing it by percentile would seeing by percentile how many of them actually got to mastery will tell you whether you are measuring whether or not kids are going to eventually get to proficiency.
Got it. That's right.
I think
Thank
that's,
you.
yep.
That's it.
I think she's also, if I may, I think she's also pointing out this is an opportunity for us to look at how people are responding to our system. So is what we have in place setting the conditions for students to be served? And are there things, is there, like, how effective is the system that we have in place? I think is part of that question. I think it'll be interesting to look at the breakdown by those percentile categories, which would be really helpful. I mean, even just the data on about a quarter of the students get the step 2 piece, because there's these questions of how are we measuring growth? And then there's the question of how do we value growth, right? So I think there's things that are coming to the top in terms of what we should be prioritizing. And that is, it's not just we're trying to answer one question, but a few of them I think are resonating.
Thank you for that, Dr. Brophy. Chris, we're going to bounce the ball back to you.
Very much. Greg, thank you for being patient. Please go ahead.
Just two quick things. First of all, I want to check my understanding of the precision issue, and that is that let's say a fourth grade reading test is built to fourth grade content standards to measure fourth grade curriculum, and it probably has some sensitivity and I'm going to use this in a sort of loose way. It has some sensitivity for students achieving like a grade above and students achieving a grade below, but it's not going to be that sensitive to students scoring very low. Chris refers to the lowest obtainable scale score. Down at that level, which is the unsatisfactory level, we're not going to have good precision there. There are likely to be adequate measurement precision at the cut scores on the threshold of unsatisfactory and approaching, but way beyond that, 2 years in either direction, above or below grade, the scores are not likely to be as stable as one would hope for. And then second, I wondered when we started talking about negative growth expectations, I was imagining that was likely going to affect mostly students at the highest performance levels. If you can think about a group of students who are conditioned on previous performance, getting the top score on an assessment last couple of years, you wouldn't expect them to get the top score again by regression to the mean. I mean, they're by error of measurement, they're likely to get a somewhat lower score. So you might have a negative expectation for them. That wouldn't be negative in a pejorative sense, right? It would be negative in a sense that their score is almost certainly not likely to be perfect 3 years in a row or 4 years in a row, whatever the conditioning takes into effect. And so for students who scored that extraordinarily high in previous years, you'd expect their score to be somewhat lower. And I think awarding points for high performance to the extent that that negative value is met makes some sense. They're not given, I wouldn't say extra points. The system doesn't give extra points for that, but it just awards the same amount of points as if one had made exceptional progress in any other way.
Greg, would that come into, I'm trying to remember the rules on the slide. I thought that if you were in advance and stayed in advance, you automatically got 150 points. So that really wouldn't even come into play. Yeah, that wouldn't even come into play.
Right. Well, I was just addressing the concern that negative growth would earn extra points, and I don't think that's the case, at least in the current model.
No, there are definitely cases where students that are outside of level 5 are having a scale score change that is negative, and they earn points in step 2. And it's not extremely uncommon. We'll get the data for you all.
Yeah, that was going to be my request, actually, that we could see where negative expectations along the score scale most likely occur.
Yep.
Yeah, Chris, that was actually my second question I was holding was I'm hoping that you're making a list as we go of specific data requests that the panel has, and also specific, let's say, specific examples for specific questions that have been raised, so that we go beyond Susie, and we look at other cases that are common within the system that we're trying to address. So if you're capturing that list, then that's going to be a lot of value added.
Thank you. Certainly, we've my wonderful colleague Chris is here taking notes. Thank you, Chris, and we also are recording it. So I expect we'll probably watch the recording to make sure we get all the nuance. And I'm going to add, and I do think it. I'm already seeing that our next meeting will almost certainly be a deep dive into a lot of questions about model attributes and performance. So if you're not already excited enough about the next meeting, I want to go ahead and put that teaser out there. But the one thing I'm even going to add to our homework list here, and I realize I'll probably be adding to my own list, is I'd love to learn more about the covariates. How much influence are each of those covariates having on the estimates? I think that's a really important question to examine. And I don't know, Thomas, if you have any reflections on how those covariates came to be identified, if it was mostly a policy exercise, or if there was any data brought to bear on that, or maybe it was a combination of both. And if you don't, that's fine. I know that happened many, many years ago. But I think that's another area that it would be really important to examine, because I don't want to vary a main point here. The model that Louisiana uses, this value-added model, is in a class that's in widespread use and is generally regarded to be technically defensible, but the decisions and business rules put on that model matter a lot. So that has things to do with covariates, has things to do with like the rules that you mentioned for awarding points for percentile gains or awarding points for being in a category. So I think all of those things should be a focus of our inquiry to see, it's not so much a judgment call about value-added models, although that can be part of what we do, but also an inquiry into how this instantiation is playing out. But I said a lot, and so I'll just go back to the point about the covariates. Do you have any insight on that, Thomas?
I have a technical report that I will share with you all that I think will give you a lot of answers on that, and we can run additional analyses on that between now and the next meeting, or now and the meeting after the next one, depending how many questions there are.
Thomas, just out of curiosity, can you ballpark me? How many covariates are we talking about?
I'm looking at a member of my team because I don't have it off the top of my head. There was a slide that shows the covariates. Let me go back to it. There it is. That's the list.
That's the complete list?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, thank you. All right, Chris, anything else from your end at this point?
Well, we wanted to give space to board members and to panelists to ask any clarifying questions before we open it up to general feedback. So before we maybe transition to that point, anything else by way of clarifying questions or comments from the panel or anybody else? Please go ahead, Mike.
It will be, may I?
Oh, yes.
Ms. Holloway?
I just wanted to say it's going to be easy to remember most of your names. Chris, Christy, Kristen. So you have the C's there. Sorry, Gregory and Mike, but we'll remember you too. That's great.
Yeah.
Mr. Lambert, did you have anything to add at this point? Yeah. Did you have anything else? All right. Do we have any public comment before we move to the next item? Yes, sir. Welcome. And please give your name for the record.
Again, my name is James Finney. I'm representing myself and math and the idea of keeping things simple. Assuming the topic is the value-added model, I have lots to say. You don't have time to hear it all. But the value-added model has very, very too many parameters. There are things in there that unnecessarily complicate the model. And it is so complicated that it has been impossible in the past for this department to explain exactly what the model is. It would be far better to abandon the value-added model completely, especially with respect to trying to tell whether teachers are doing a good job or not, and look at something much simpler in terms of whether a particular teacher's students have generally risen compared to their peers in a percentile basis or generally regressed with regard to their peers statewide. That would be easy to explain. And it would be easy to write a 5 or 10 page technical report that covered everything instead of a 200-page technical report that leaves more questions asked than answered. So for years, my sense has been that Bessie has been trying to take a very badly designed school performance score system and make minor tweaks to try to fix it. It should be entirely thrown out. All the dire consequences of bad grades should be abandoned. And if you're going to report on what happens in schools, it should be done in a simple fashion. It should be done carefully, and then don't mess with it for about 20 years, and maybe we'll finally have useful data. When the former superintendent and possibly current superintendent's goal was to disrupt things and push toward privatization, there was an incentive, I think, to come up with new and more creative ways to make traditional education look bad so that charter schools could come in and take over. That hasn't worked well for the children of this state. And it's time to go for good data, clearly presented, and thinking about things that actually work to benefit students. And one more thought. Any system that incentivizes a school to put more emphasis on moving a kid from, say, an 89% level on a test to a 90%, rather than moving them from getting no questions right to getting 20 or 30% right, is a morally bankrupt system. And that's what you have, and that's what I hope that you will abandon. And I could talk for hours, but I won't. Thanks for your time.
Thank you for your comments. Is there any other public comment? All right, hearing none, we're going to move to the next item. I'd like to get a motion for consideration of discussion for next steps regarding the growth model.
So move.
Second, Ms. Holloway. All right, Chris, you've got the ball.
Well, I think we've gotten a lot of this in our conversation already. We've got a lot of great ideas from the panel and from the board about areas of inquiry. And as was noted, we will make sure we document those and follow up with them. I think that's going to be a promising area for us to focus on in our next meeting. But let me open it up for any other of my colleagues on the panel. Are there priorities that you'd like to identify for future inquiry or discussion in service to identifying next steps? Mike, please go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but one of the questions I'm thinking about is what is in scope for what we're considering here? Because it seems to me we've touched on at least 3 topics. One is the VAM model itself and whether there's a different model or method that might be used for just giving a student a growth estimate. The second is the point system. So how those growth estimates are then being used and how the points allocation and the spread from 0 to 25 to 85, and I think the third then is it comes into play on the kind of the sensitivity and precision, particularly at the lower bound, which is really an assessment instrument design issue. But it obviously impacts some questions about the value of the model potentially at the lowest for the lowest performing students. So I guess my question really is like, what of that is in bounds for our consideration, and what is out of scope?
I really like that framing, the model itself and its advantages or limitations in comparison with other models. The you call it a point system. I think in general we could call that maybe its implementation, or it's the business rules and so forth. So, and then the third is some of these technical features like sensitivity. We could add other technical aspects like reliability. I think all of that is, in my judgment, in scope, and I think it's a really clever framing, Mike, to help guide sort of some of these areas of inquiry. And as I understand it, again, I know my colleagues at Baton Rouge will correct me if I misspeak, but that's all well within areas we're invited to review and to provide advice about. And I think it's not so much that we're trying to identify a winner, it's that we're trying to help the board see the relative strengths and weaknesses of alternate approaches or alternate implementation strategies so that they can inform their decision making.
I think that was very well put from my perspective. I haven't seen the frequency distribution, for the student population, so I don't have that perspective right now. But my understanding is that half the kids of the state don't read at grade level, for example. So that gives you some sense of what it would look like. And this whole exercise, in my view, a lot of it is the focus of it is about finding the right assessment approach for this student population, right? So for me, that's key. So once we see what that frequency distribution looks like, we should have a good sense of what we're working with. And then again, just want to again make the point that we're interested in your professional assessment of the pros and the cons of each. So we started today with the base case. So we're interested in your comments, your feedback on the pros and cons of the base case for this student population. And then this next board will look at that, and they'll have that technical assessment of what we're looking at with the base case. And then once you guys put this list of options together, then they'll have a sense what they have to work with regard to any potential options. Is that helpful?
I have a comment also, Mr. Morris. So one aspect that I think was mentioned, but we didn't really dig into, is the tests that we use were created prior to growth being emphasized in the way that it is. And so we get new standards in like 2010. We get a new test prior to ESSA even being passed. And so we are using growth on a test that wasn't created to measure growth. And we have a board that is, I'll say experienced, right? So we have a number of members who have been on for a long time. Myself for 12 years, Kira Orange-Jones the same, Jim Garvey's like finishing up 16 years. So people who have this like long historical context, but you're going to have a majority new board. And so I think we need to also be asking ourselves, do we have the right tests to do what we want to achieve? Because it wasn't built for that purpose. And maybe it's just fine. But when I hear people talk about our students who are below level, and the small percentage of questions that are actually even assessing students at the lower levels, it just makes me question if we're using the right tests. And so I think it varies no, the test isn't that old. So the standards were adopted in 2010. And I don't know when we started using this test, but the tests came before ESSA was even passed. So the tests were being created to reflect the new standards
15.
Yeah, if I had to guess when the new test was, I would say it was probably about 2015. That ESSA gets passed, I think it was December of 2015, shifts everybody's focus to growth. And so we created the best we could, a system with the tests that we had at the time. We had just invested in even building these tests, but we weren't talking about growth there. And I mean, when you ask questions about vertical alignment, but you didn't build a test for vertical alignment, I don't know. I'm not a psychometrician, but I'm starting to wonder if that shouldn't be part of the conversation that we're having. And if we're going to go through the exercise of making recommendations to a new board, I just would feel like I haven't done my service if I didn't point out this historical context behind it. It looks like Gregory's had his hand up, though. Sorry about cutting in front of you there.
That's all right. Please call me Chris if you'd like, so I can blend in with everyone else. So, you know, there's a Chris Domleski will have to inform us as to scope here. You know, I was invited to participate in a growth panel, right? And I can't help but acknowledge that assessment design and accountability systems are so inextricably linked these days that you can't tinker with one without implications for the other. The current one, absolutely right, as the previous speaker just mentioned, was designed to measure on grade level learning for kids. It wasn't designed to measure far out of grade level learning. That's a different purpose, which could be incorporated into a new assessment design, but would receive, in my experience, all kinds of pushback because the test would have to be lengthened, or the whole psychometric model of the test changed, and item banks developed to be able to measure far out of grade level. So that's a big shift in scope if we want to redesign the assessment program. I'm not opposed to it or making suggestions or making those observations, but because they're so inextricably linked, there are clear implications if one desires to measure as precisely at the extremes, at high and low performing students. But I had a couple of ideas that might help us understand the nature of the problem, if there is one. One would be something called an item map. This is, and I'm hoping that for purposes of informing the board, we could even have an illustration of such a map going forward, which would show where the items on the test are measuring in terms of student abilities and where the students themselves are who are taking the test. So you'd get a sense of the extent to which the test really is measuring, the questions on the tests really are measuring the majority of kids who are taking those tests, or maybe they're mismatched. You know, maybe there's some degree of misalignment, so that it's very clear that kids at one extreme or another are not being measured well at all by the way the test is currently designed. So I'll just toss in the idea of a brief tutorial on what an item map looks like, which I think would be very informative, even a couple of samples of those from extant data across the grade levels. The other thing would be, again, to understand the nature of any mismatch, would be to look at a conditional standard error of measurement plot. So you'd see all the scale scores along, let's say, the x-axis, and the conditional standard error of measurement along the y-axis, and it would be this U-shaped plot with high tails at each end showing imprecise measurement. But for each of the scale scores along the bottom, it would be also nice to sort of plot end counts, observed end counts, or percents of students at a grade and subject level. So you can see, for example, what percent of students are getting those high CSEMs, those imprecisions in their measurement at the extremes where that occurs. So if that was possible to even get a sample, even if it's hypothetical, but real data would be best, and I think it's probably available and easy enough to come up with, a sample item map and a sample CSEM with end counts or percentages. I think that'd be very helpful for our discussions.
I think those are terrific ideas, Greg. Thank you very much. Christine, and forgive me if I'm not saying your name right. I see you have your hand up.
Thank you very much. I will start by saying that I am also not a psychometrician, so I am looking forward to continuing to better understand VAM as it applies to Louisiana and the process. One thing I think it's appropriate that I'm piggybacking off of Gregory, because in terms of the implications of how we rank and sort schools in calculating student growth, when we are thinking about what we're not capturing or the stories that we're not telling with regard to progress being made by students in schools, I do think that it's important for us to think about not just how we're identifying schools that need support through annual meaningful differentiation, but whether and how an adjustment to our ability to gauge students who are kind of at either end in terms of the sensitivity that we might not be capturing, whether we might adjust our exit criteria for schools that have been identified for improvement. If there is a way to capture and award schools for progress that we might not be able to do in an annual growth score, but that we might be able to calculate and recognize so that it's almost a hold harmless that allows schools to exit from comprehensive support and improvement status, or UIR, I believe, but that wouldn't necessarily impact, our focus on whether or not students are performing in a satisfactory manner on grade level. And again, this going back to what previous speakers said, maybe beyond the scope, but in our ability to drill down and gauge what students know and can do, it may be helpful to think about how we can recognize that in other places under the law, under accountability.
Yeah, just a brief comment with regard to scope again. Our objective here is, we're trying to find the best assessment tool that we can to assess individual student growth for students in the state of Louisiana. So I just want to be clear on our objective there. So that part of that could be the test, could be other considerations, but we want this next board to be, well advised of all of those sensitivities.
I would be, if we've got a few moments for this, Mr. Morris and others, I'd be interested in hearing any feedback, particularly from members of the board who are there, or members of the department, about kinds of things you're hearing or the kinds of perspectives that have emerged that led to this panel being formed and led to us asking these questions. Is there anything you'd want to let this panel know about the kinds of feedback that you're hearing from around the state that can help us sharpen our focus?
Dr. Bofi?
Yes. So I have heard an interest from people in wanting to reward growth at a higher level. And so I think it's 25% is the growth in our accountability system. And so our board had conversations about, is 25% right? And what we found is you can't say 25% in Louisiana is the same as somebody else's 25%. And you can't say 25% in Louisiana is lower than somebody else's 35%, right? Now I have a hard time explaining to people why that can be true, but it's the way that we're calculating growth. And so when you start having questions of, are you valuing growth at the right number or the right percentage, then it pushes you to have conversations of, are you calculating growth in the right way? And then leads us to conversations of, well, our tests really weren't designed for growth to begin with. And so it's something that our board worked at. We had members who are committed and who are interested in seeing it different. At the same time, there's still the struggle around the more often that you change the accountability system, the more you create confusion for educators, right? Because you roll out an accountability system, you set long-term goals, but then anytime you start making a tweak, people start asking you questions and you're not able to compare year to year. So that's really where it started. Is I think there was a consensus of people who were interested in awarding growth at a higher percentage, because we were, I believe, generally lower than some of the other states. But then when you start looking at how is growth calculated, it just it's a complex issue. I think is the reason we even need to have these kinds of conversations, and when we need to bring in experts. I think I really am glad to know that you all have worked with other states and can provide perspectives of how it's worked in other states. I'd like to always bring us back to what can we do in service to students? You know, how can we use this to where it is helping people make decisions that better support every child in Louisiana? And when a system gets so complex that it's hard to explain, even to people who have an expertise in this area, right? Like you have questions about our system when this is your area of expertise. When it gets hard to explain, it makes it hard to use it as a tool.
Great comments. Ms. Holloway, you wanted to add to that?
Yes, and Holly's making great points. People want to understand how our score is calculated, and it's, as you heard earlier with Thomas, it's so complicated. And if we can't express or understand, surely our parents, educators have a difficult time. So we'd love to have an understanding. Not that we want it easier. We do want rigor, but to understand it. Another is rewarding growth, which Holly's made that comment. Another is the dissatisfaction with VAM because of the step 1 and 2. We talked about that. That was out there in as comments. And also the question is LEAP the most effective assessment? And can we do better? Is there something else out there? And that's it.
Yeah, so great point. So we spoke to the test itself. Want to make sure you guys have some appreciation for the test itself. So hopefully we'll be able to share that information with you, appropriate examples for different cases. A lot of good conversation about the value that we find in addressing the complexity so that the better we understand it, the better teachers understand it, parents understand it. Then I think to Dr. Bophy's point, it's easier to use it as a means of incentive if people can understand it, right? As we set goals and so forth. And we know that goals are reasonable. They're set at an appropriate level. They are achievable. And it makes us feel good when we achieve those goals. If we know what the basis is and we can recognize our potential. And then also, I thought we did a good job today making the point about the student population here. We talked about that frequency distribution, what that's going to look like. So you guys have some appreciation for the base case, the student population that we're working with, that we're trying to find the right fit here, the best tool that we can to do the job. Happy to address any other questions you guys might have about scope so that we're clear on that. We don't want to, get off in a ditch, on our scope. We want to stay on track. But at the same time, this is a great opportunity. We've got this group of subject matter experts on board. We want to make sure that we complete the task. We've got a quality product and that this next board is well advised and they can make an informed decision as appropriate.
Mr. Morris, can I offer a couple additional thoughts?
Yes, sir. Please do, Mr. Lambert.
And I'm surprised that you didn't say this one specifically because I've heard you tell it to me multiple times. This kind of started in a place where the question that Dr. Bophy brought up was around people perceived that growth wasn't weighted high enough. And part of that is driven by correlations with socioeconomic status and a lot of things that people look at and say, there's a problem with our accountability system. And as that conversation went on, we started looking at the way that the letter grades on growth break out. And you see that 85% of schools are an A or a B for growth in our state. So then it becomes this question of, well, if you increase the weight of growth and growth is helping everyone, it's not actually helping anyone, right? If you give everybody a bump up, it just moves everybody farther to the right, but it doesn't actually change your ranking in any real way to help you differentiate schools any better. So all of that to say, one of the things that Mr. Morris brought up at the end of the last process that we went through is this idea that it's awful that a school can be an A for growth and an F overall. And the challenge is that solving that when you increase the weight enough to make that no longer true, you then bump everybody else up, and that school that is actually growing kids looks like a school that is not actually growing kids. So we want to solve both of those things, or at least have some ideas of how to solve both of those things.
Right. Thank you for that, Mr. Lambert. So there's really, I guess, at a macro level, there's really two conversations here. One is, how do you accurately assess individual student growth? And then how do you take the growth component and appropriately allocate it in your SPS, right? So those are really two separate conversations. But obviously we want your feedback on both. And then Mr. Lambert did accurately identify a concern that I had raised, which I think is definitely a driving point for this exercise. How can you possibly give a school an F as an SPS score when they've got an A for growth? It's just counterproductive thought process. I just don't get it. So that's obviously a concern that we'd like to address as well. But I think that concludes the comments at the panel now. Chris, back to you.
Thank you, Mr. Everybody. I don't know if people can see the chat, but unfortunately, Greg Cizik had to step away to a prior commitment, so we've just lost him. Mike, I see you have your hand up, so please go ahead.
Yeah, another question I'm wondering if we should think about a little bit is there's an interesting article by David Gilburn on I think it's called The Color of Numbers, in which he argues that when you use these regression models with covariates, they improve the prediction of whatever outcomes you're trying to predict, right? So there's no question about that. You get improved predictions. But when you then use those to establish expectations for different groups of kids, you actually are establishing different expectations, right? So in that example on, whatever her name was, Susie or whatever the student was, like she had, I forget, she was in a group, EL maybe it was, and so therefore it was a minus 1.5, which is really saying that we expect less growth for her because of her EL status than a student who's not EL. And if she, compared to her other EL students, reaches it, we say, okay, great, she did great. But in reality, she's falling further and further behind other peers who originally scored at the same level as she did previously. So I just wonder if that's a question that we should be thinking about too, is even though from a teacher's perspective, you want to take into consideration the characteristics and the challenges of the students you teach. And from a predictive modeling perspective, you want to explain as much variance, which adding covariates typically does, not always, but typically. But yet for an individual student expectation, that leads to different expectations based on these, different social and individual characteristics. So I'm not advocating, I'm just wondering if that's a part of what we should be considering.
That's an important. In the intersection of policy and technical is inextricable, and I think that's a great example. And I think if you ask folks, do you want a growth model that creates expectations that are tailored really well to academic peer groups and minimize the relationship between factors like economic disadvantage and outcomes? Most people will say yes. But if you ask people, do you think we ought to have different outcomes for different groups? I think most people would say no. And there's an inherent tension in there. And I think giving voice to that is very important. And the other danger is that you mask effects that you care about detecting. If a school isn't serving language learners well or something like that, then that's part of what you want to make sure you don't obscure in your policies. So pardon me, Christy, I hope I didn't interrupt you. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say I absolutely agree with you bringing that up, Mike, that we do set different expectations for students, not just based on student characteristics, but also prior scores. So I think it's really important that the board, as they're presenting their goals or expectations for what school accountability is it having all students meet high expectations or having students meet expectations we set for them based on what they previously had done is a big question. And I will advocate that if you are really trying to move the needle on student improvement and grow your economy and build your base for the state of Louisiana, that it shouldn't matter where kids are, but it should matter where kids end up. So if that means more expectations for students that are further behind and more resources and technical support and help for those students, I think it's really important that we have the same high expectations for all students and not differentiate because some students come to us a little bit further behind because they're all going to end up in our community. And we're not going to be controlling for those things once they leave high school. So I think that is a big thing for students. And when I always look at accountability systems, I'm always thinking about it from the student perspective of, is this outcome meaningful for the student? And if the outcome is meaningful for the student, then the school should earn points for it. If it's an outcome that's not meaningful for students, schools shouldn't be earning points for it. And it's a very tough thing to do because expectations can be very high, but we're trying to prepare students for life after high school, not just prepare them to make growth relative to their peers. So I do have a strong opinion about making sure that as we're looking towards what's best for Louisiana, we're looking at what is best for students, not just what is best for schools.
And that's why we brought you guys to the table, is to get that perspective so that we can create this list of different options for the next board. So really appreciate that feedback. All right, Chris, anything else before we move on?
Nothing for me. No, sir.
All right. So we got a motion on the floor here, consideration of discussion and next steps regarding the growth model. Maybe before we close out, we could just, Chris, briefly talk about the next meeting, what we'll be looking at going forward there, and then we're going to open it up for public comment before we adjourn.
That's good. Well, I think for logistically speaking, we'll poll members probably for the remaining meetings for the fall. People will know how hard we worked to find this date, and you guys were gracious in making time for this. Thank you. So I'll take that as a to-do step for me and my colleagues here at the centers. We'll make sure that we get with the folks at LDOE and Bessie and the panel and get some meeting dates on the calendar soon. We'll comb through the notes. And again, I know that there were several great suggestions that were offered up by the panel and by the board today regarding areas that we can inspect and to grow in our understanding of how well the model is working, which will help us to provide some sharp advice. So we'll use that to structure the agenda for the next meeting, and for fellow panel members, if there are materials we can flow you before the meeting, we'll try to do just that. So give you an opportunity to come ready for more good discussions. But other than that, I don't have anything else. I don't know if any of the other panel members do in terms of suggested next steps. Okay, so that's all for me. Ready to go to public comment whenever you are.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you, panel. Sometimes timing is funny, but I want to recognize everyone here today. And unfortunately, one of our board members does have a full-time job, and she's been working all day and was just able to join us. I want to recognize Bessie member Belinda Davis and just give her an opportunity to introduce herself and address the panel in any way or anything that she'd like to.
Thank you for that, Ronnie. Sorry, I was teaching class today, so hopefully the other meetings will be around my teaching schedule. But I will watch the recording of this and bring myself up to speed. And I'm excited about the work the group's going to do. Thank you. I'm excited about being a part of it.
All right, before we close out, do we have any other public comment? All right, looks like we have one. Dr. Finney would like to address the board. He wishes to speak and he opposes the recommendation. Dr. Finney, please identify yourself and tell us what you'd like us to hear.
I'm James Finney from Baton Rouge. I'm not sure what the recommendation is, so I'm ambiguous, but I do have several comments. First, it is refreshing to see Bessie listening to expertise. My next thought is the current accountability system measures poverty versus affluence very well. It does not measure educational quality in the slightest little bit. And it's time for Bessie to quit pretending that it does. The current system would make it appear that a teacher was very effective if she took a class full of students scoring in the 99th percentile and dropped them all to the 94th percentile. That she would still be contributing a massive number of points to that school's performance score and that district's performance score. Compare that to another teacher who took students who couldn't get a single question right to jumping all the way up to approaching basic. That teacher is clearly a rock star, and the school performance score would be much lower for that cohort. That needs to change. The current system, yeah, I said that. Okay, the public has no confidence in the relationship between raw scores and scaled scores. There is a quite credible impression that those were done to meet the whims of the prior administration, and I haven't seen anything to convince me that they are as scientific as one might pretend they are. Furthermore, having 150 point grading scale adds an unnecessary amount of absurdity, as though it was the purpose of the administration to make things more confusing than they need to be. This is probably more important, and I was inspired by what Dr. Boffey said earlier, although maybe this wasn't what she meant. I teach math at a trade school. I have long periods. I give tests every single time I meet the students. But I also grade the tests immediately and give them back and answer questions. When you force students to sit through several days of testing and they get no feedback, at least not immediately, and not very useful feedback ever, you're wasting the kids' time, you're wasting the public's time, you're wasting a lot of money. The test should be, at least the test banks should be created by the teachers that are teaching the students. You might need somebody sitting in this building that randomly collects a few tests and writes one test. The teachers give the test. They give an unofficial grade. The students get to see it the next day, so they actually get some value out of it, and then send the originals off to the state and they can be regraded. The current system is just a way of a bunch of adults keeping score without taking into consideration the interests of the students that are forced to take those tests. Furthermore, the data should be freely, widely, and easily available without somebody having to file record requests after record request and then sue when the record requests aren't acknowledged, and finally get good turnaround after having won a lawsuit or several. And finally, Bessie members need to be concerned with providing quality education to every student, not doing what a bunch of well-connected businesses would like them to do with public money that advantages those businesses at the cost of what's good for students. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, sir. I believe that concludes our public comments. I did want to speak to a couple of Dr. Finney's points that weren't raised during our discussion, and that was the point he made about 150-point scale. I've received a lot of feedback on that one, so I wanted to share that with the panel. And then I've also personally received a lot of feedback about how long it takes to get the test results back so that we can use them for planning for the next school year. So I wanted to share that with you guys as well. Capture that in your notes and should be points of consideration. So we've concluded public comment. Just want to make sure board members had any additional comments before we adjourn. Hearing none, do I have a motion for adjournment? Dr. Bofi and a second, Ms. Holloway. We're adjourned. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day. Go Tigers.
Thank you.
Thank you all. I appreciate the great conversation today.